questioning is perhaps the greatest gift we have as human beings.
Science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking.
It's a way of thinking that teaches us to question everything we think we know.
Science came about by developing techniques, methodologies for gaining reliable knowledge about the world.
We have at our fingertips the technologies that were only possible for the largest governments and corporations 20 years ago as an individual today.
If human civilization continued at anything remotely like the current pace of technology advancement for 1 million years, where would we be? I think we're either extinct or on a lot of planets.
The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it.
We hold the scientific method in high regard because it works. If it stopped working, we'd throw it out.
Discover the past.
Create the future.
This is the Here and How podcast.
Welcome to the Here and How podcast, where every week we dive deep into big ideas, exploring the past to create a brighter future. This is episode 30. Is abortion okay? It's a big, complicated one this week. My name is Rachel Oates, and I'm joined by the wonderful Thomas Westbrook and Steve Woodford. Do you guys want to say hi?
Hello.
So, huge one this week. I don't know how long the episode's going to be. I don't know how intense it's going to be. I don't know how much we're going to disagree or argue about a few things. But abortion is a kind of big, huge, complicated topic. I want to give a very kind of brief overview in these first couple of minutes about kind of the sort of stuff we could or maybe should talk about. And then I'm going to basically just open up the floor and we can just see where the conversation goes, if that sounds okay with you guys.
Perfect.
Yeah. So like I say, I'm not really sure if we can do this justice in just an hour. It might go a little bit over. But we are always trying to discuss these really big ideas on the podcast. And we've spoken about huge things like antibiotic resistance and big philosophical issues. We've spoken about where life came from and other alien life. And while they're really, really important in the scientific communities and, for the past and the future and all that sort of stuff, abortion is one of these big issues that's really, really relevant now, which is why I think it's so important that we talk about it. And abortion is by no means as simple as just killing babies. Is it good or bad? It's not even as simple as just when does something become a person. It's not even just a moral or ethical or philosophical issue. There are so many facets to how we have to look at it. It is a moral debate, but it's also a scientific debate, a philosophical debate, a social, political, religious, legal and economic debate. You can't just consider one angle. You have to kind of bring in a little bit of everything. It's also very, very emotional, and we can't discount the people involved and their emotions. We have to take those into account. We can't just be completely objective on this, which is where it does get a little bit difficult. So, like I say, we're going to try and cover as much as possible in this episode, but if we do miss some bits out, then, viewers, listeners can feel free to drop us a comment or a message and tell us what they think we should, what areas we should have spoken about or what we can focus on in the future and so on, if that makes sense. So I'm very, very briefly, because I realize I'm talking a lot in this opening bit, gonna kind of basically blast you with a few questions and things we should consider on each of these issues, and then we'll open up the conversation, if that's okay?
Perfect.
Yeah, all right. Sorry, I know I'm talking kind of at you a little bit at this point, but we can kind of get into this properly in a second.
You're leading the episode.
So...
You're only doing what me and Thomas do on ours, so
you're doing what I do on everyone's episode every single time, just because I am verbose as hell.
In that case, you can call me Thomas today.
Go for it, Rachel. I
feel very handsome and smart.
Oh,
big compliment.
Not really coming from me, Clearly, I have no taste. I date Dan.
Wow.
I'm joking.
What a catch.
Poor Dan. Does he listen to the podcast?
I keep trying to get him to. I feel like the more I insult him, the more he might actually listen to it.
This is true.
Oh, he'll be like, what is she saying about me behind my back?
Exactly.
It's amazing. It's like you complimented Thomas and then you took it back by throwing him under the bus with Dan. You just brought Dan in for no reason. What's he done? Did he not clear the sink? What happened?
It's like Yeah, Dan didn't do the dishes, and so now Rachel's taking it out on him in the podcast.
Okay.
I guess Dan has been sleeping in Kyra's bed for the last few days.
He's been aborted out of the bed.
I'm not going to take us off track. I know we don't have a lot of time
right.
for this episode.
Okay, so, like I said, I'm going to kind of like very quickly cover all the kind of big areas and lots of different questions we can ask, and then we'll just kind of like jump into the discussion bit. So, when we talk about abortion and debate it scientifically, we first need to really, really understand how an embryo and a baby develops in the womb. We need to understand all those stages. We need to know what is the difference between a fertilized egg and a 9-month-old fetus and an actual baby out of the womb. What is the difference there? It's also probably at this point important to mention that when we say these words, people normally call an embryo anywhere between conception and 2 months. A fetus is 2 months to birth, and then after birth, it's just a tiny little baba, or baby if you want to be normal. We need to think about at what. Don't laugh at that. We need to think about at what stage a fetus or an embryo develops things like a consciousness, an ability to feel pain, any kind of like self-awareness or things like that. We have to think about what happens when a fetus or an embryo starts affecting the mother, the host essentially, their physical or mental health. At what point does one become more important than the other? At what point does a fetus or an embryo develop autonomy to be considered as a separate entity from the mother? And to what extent should we consider a woman wanting control over her own body? So it's kind of like the whole, is it a parasite? Is it not? Does it matter if it's wanted or not? At what point does it become a human being? You know, lots and lots of stuff to consider there. And there's a lot of science to back up lots of different points to the argument. Legally, we have to consider, if we did criminalize abortions, how would this affect the world? Like, likely abortions would still happen, but they'd be done by like shady doctors in back alley little clinics and stuff, or women would try at home. Likely this would result in the deaths of a large number of women and probably the arrest of a hell of a lot of good and bad doctors. So we have to think about, is it worth it? Risking the lives of those women, is it worth it for some unborn babies, essentially? We also need to consider, what are the current laws? Why are they in place? What influences the lawmaking? And should we figure out a way to change them at all? Do they need changing? Economically, a lot of people don't like to think about this because they think, oh, you can't put a price on human life. But let's be honest, that's not practical at all. You have to think, if a baby's born, can a person afford it? Can they afford to give it a good enough life? If that baby, like, that would have been aborted goes on to be born, we have to think about healthcare costs for the pregnant mother. We have to think about the strain on social services when unwanted children are given up. We have to think about the consequences of overpopulation. It's naive to think we can just say abortion is bad and forget about all the stuff that comes with babies being born after that. Socially, a baby is a huge strain on someone's life. If a person isn't ready for that, should they be forced into it? There can be positive and negative outcomes from a person having a baby they don't want, but is it really anyone's right to take away that choice from a woman? If a woman's now free to choose her career, her partner, I know she can vote, she can choose where she lives. Why can't she choose what goes on in her own body? Why can't she choose when she has kids, if she has kids? And then in the same vein, we have to consider, what about the fathers of the babies? Do they get a say? When do they get a say? How much of a say do they have compared to the mother? Is there ever a point where someone should have a right over another person's body and what's going on inside it? Religiously, it sounds horrible, but we do have to consider religious people and their beliefs, because religious people make up a huge part of the population. But at what point should we kind of stop them and say, wait, this isn't your business anymore? For example, if a person doesn't want to have an abortion for religious reasons, that should be fine. But if they're petitioning against someone having an abortion because of religious reasons, that's kind of not okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think the answer there is separation of church and state. Mm-hmm. So if you're religious and you have religious views that do not correlate with what the science shows, with what necessarily reason and logic is showing, then you can do what you want, but you can't make someone else do it. And that's
this isn't a atheist versus religious debate, because I know atheists who are pro-choice and who are pro-life.
Yeah.
And so it really comes down to, and even if you're in favor of a woman's right to choose to have an abortion, then there's the question of at what point, is it at what point in the process is it okay and not okay, and under what circumstances. So there is a debate to be had. It's not just black and white, all or nothing, but it's a complicated topic. And I'm sure we'll get into some of the details.
I was just going to add on that one as well. Like, my question would be, is emotionally manipulating a woman into keeping a baby any different than emotionally manipulating a woman into killing her baby? Which is something that religious people often do, like the keeping a baby thing. The last point I just want to bring up is the emotional side of the argument. And a big part of this comes into the whole sort of meaning we ascribe to things and how we feel emotional attachment to things and so on. When we're discussing abortion, God, that's really hard to say. We can never just come up with this one size fits all answer. It's always going to be different for every single person, and it's very hard to say all abortion is good, all abortion is bad. We can't do that, obviously. When a person has something growing in their body, they can have very different reactions to that. It might be repulsion, it might be love, it might be indifference, it might just be something in between all of those. But we have to consider, is that thing that's growing wanted, or is it leeching resources from the host without permission? Is a 3-week-old fetus, or embryo, any less of a parasite than worms if it's not wanted? Similarly, if the thing is wanted and loved by the host, then does it matter what the cellular structure is? This sounds really silly, but I was recently watching an episode of Bones where Hodgins literally, he let some bugs lay eggs in his neck or something, and they hatched, and he let this little parasite grow in him, and he loved them, he wanted them. Is that any different from a woman essentially growing a baby because it's another life form leeching off a host, but it's wanted and it's loved and it's cared for? And it might sound really, really silly, but it's kind of something to consider. What is the difference between different kinds of wanted cells and unwanted cells? Is there a difference? So it's a very, very big, complicated thing, and there's a lot of questions. I have a few examples of the trolley problem to put to you guys to see kind of where you are on certain things, and just to give us an idea of what some of our views might be and try and get you thinking a little bit differently about things. Do you want to start with those, or do you want to come back to them later?
No, I'm down to start with that.
Let's go for it.
Okay, so a big kind of typical one that honestly a lot of pro-choicers use is, imagine you've got a fertility clinic that's on fire and you can save 500 fertilized little in vitro embryos or one fully sort of couple of month old baby. Which one do you save?
You were saying about the fertilized embryos.
Mm-hmm.
How long ago were they fertilized?
As in, they're ready to be implanted into a womb right now.
I mean, it's.
Do you know how many weeks that is?
Usually less than a week when you're doing IVF.
Okay. Then in that case, the human.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely the human. And honestly, even you said that an embryo is up to how many weeks? 12 weeks? 8 weeks? And then it becomes a fetus.
Let me just double check that so I don't get it wrong. Embryo is from conception to 2 months. Fetus is 2 months to birth. There we go.
Okay, so about 8 weeks in, at that point, it doesn't have really anything, it doesn't have any kind of brain developed. It can't feel pain. It doesn't have consciousness. It doesn't have any kind of thought. Absolutely the baby every single time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this is kind of like a bit of a got you for the people who think life begins at conception. But for a lot of people, that's an easy one. What if you had 5 little in vitro embryos, and they're fertilized, they have the potential to become little people, they can go into a womb any moment, right? But the parents are dead, and no one necessarily really wants the babies now. They don't have parents anymore. Or one little in vitro embryo where it does have parents and it's ready to go into a womb. Does that make sense? Which one would you save? So 5 unwanted embryos or 1 wanted embryo?
Well, this one's, to me, it's just as obvious of a choice because we do this literally all the time with IVF.
Yeah.
Like you take a bunch of eggs and you fertilize them, and the ones that are the one that is the most viable that's wanted by the parents is implanted into the woman. And this was contested on religious grounds, back in, I want to say like the 60s or 70s. I forget when the battle was over it, and they don't really even contest this anymore. It's not even really a religious issue, but for most people anymore, because it helps a woman to conceive who otherwise is having trouble. And the leftovers, the remnants, are thrown away, and in the best cases, they're saved for stem cell research, so that we can use the stem cells to develop cures for all kinds of different genetic diseases. So yeah, absolutely the one that's wanted.
I completely agree on that, and I think it's quite an obvious one, but to some people,
I don't know if that's obvious. Yeah, so maybe I count as that. Help me keep up to speed with you, I guess.
Yeah.
So you're saying there's 5 embryos versus 1 embryo.
Yeah.
One of them's wanted, but 5 of them are just inseminated. That's all.
5 of them, like, they don't have parents anymore. They don't necessarily have anywhere to go, if that makes sense.
Right.
I mean, we're talking a cluster of cells, literally a cluster of cells. Like,
yeah,
this is not.
But that's the same. It's just a cluster of cells for the person that wants it as well.
But I disagree, because you've had someone applying an emotional kind of like attachment or tag to it.
I agree with this.
That's what makes it different for me.
Yeah, no, I agree with this. But what I'm trying to understand, and I think I do understand it, is that so far as the evidence shows, these are just, as you said, Thomas, clumps of cells. There's no nervous system. There's nothing sufficiently developed to call it, a living being, let alone a human. Therefore, the question may as well be, there's 5 grains of sand, or you can save 1 grain of sand that somebody wants for their dinner. I'll save the 1, simply because, to me, these are inanimate objects at that point.
Yeah. Well, to all of them,
fair.
I honestly don't see anything morally wrong with all of them being thrown out. But
me neither.
It's except for the fact that in the case of the one that's wanted, that what I find as kind of the moral slight to be that you're dashing the hopes of the parents.
Yeah, it's
and
like, well,
so when this is one area that I want to get into. I'm not sure if we'll have time down the road, but I don't want to seem insensitive when I start arguing from a scientific stance that, at certain points that, a fetus isn't, a developed human, that it's not, I don't want to seem insensitive to people who have had miscarriages and who found them incredibly traumatic. But I do want to point out that in those cases, while my sympathy is 100% for them, they, they're losing the hope of a child. And it's you go through a similar type of pain when you find out that you're infertile and you've wanted to have a kid, you've been excited to have kids, and then you go to the doctor's office and you find out, you take a test and you find out you can never have your own children. And even though no one has technically, been no loss of life, you're still, devastated because
there's a loss of potential life.
There's a loss of hope for having a kid. And so in this case, it's like, it's just a cluster of cells. It hasn't developed. It's just, it's still in a petri dish. But in one of those cases, there's, 2 expecting hopeful parents who are like, they're, planning their future on it. And you're dashing their hopes by getting rid of it. And the other 5 are just, they're leftovers. They're just cells.
Okay, so I'm up to speed and I'm with you both.
Okay, so now in like a very similar sort of question, but it gets a little bit more iffy. Imagine you've got 2 little embryos. Both of them are wanted by their parents, but one of them is like the last chance for parents. Maybe like one of them's had cancer treatments and they have no more eggs or sperm or whatever. But the other one, the parent has a choice to go on and have more kids afterwards. Which one do you save there?
The one with a less chance. These are just considerations of human beings, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
because the fact that we're talking about embryos to me is just, as I said, it's an inanimate object at that point, and so it's just, well, who's better to service in this situation? So it's a very easy one for me.
Yeah. Again, if the people who it's their last chance, if it fails, then they're going to be way more heartbroken than the ones that are like, well, we failed this time, but we can have another go.
Yeah.
It'll suck. It's not, they're still going to be disappointed, but it's not to the same extent. So
you guys are doing something here that I think is really important, and you're considering the lives of the people involved. You're not just, you're not just looking at it objectively, if that makes sense, because this is something that is influenced by, like, actual people's lifestyles.
I think so. I understand what you're saying. Yeah, I do understand what you're saying, but I think this is an exercise of objectivity, because the objectivity necessarily does need to take into account the feelings of those that the child's going, or the potential child is going to affect. The reason why I think,
a good point.
Yeah, I mean, like, the reason why I think that this is where I think that I might disagree with you both, is as we get further down the line from embryo to where it does start becoming questionable whether or not this is a human being, that's where I think the value on the preferences on those around them significantly diminish, just due to the fact that we are actually talking about a life at that point. And the reason for that, there's many, which we'll get into, so I won't lay them out here.
That's
but
okay.
Yeah, do continue.
Okay.
I think that both Rachel and I would agree with you to some extent. Where the disagreement might arise is at what point that occurs.
Yeah, I think that might be an area.
So
that's definitely something we can talk about in a second. I do have a couple more of these that are kind of getting a little bit more kind of complicated, but you guys know that I've got a stuffed lamb called Lullaby, right? And she's been everywhere with me. Like, I've had her for the last 18 years, and I love her more than anything. She was one of the last things my granny ever bought me. She comes to every, like, doctor's and dentist's appointment with me. If my house is on fire, she is the first thing I would grab to save. Now, imagine in a fire, you could save my Lullaby or an unwanted embryo. What would you pick?
Your Lullaby.
Yeah?
Yeah.
See, for some people, like, that's kind of... they would go the other way because they'd be like, oh, but that's the potential for human life. But then, again, I would go for Lullaby because I've got this, like, emotional attachment to it. And, like, what to her? And that means a hell of a lot to me.
I think it really comes down to us three seem to be united in the sense that we don't see it as anything other than, say, any other inanimate form of biology, such as a cactus or a leaf. Even in fact, it's even less than that. So for us, it's an easy question. But for somebody who is at least suspects that it's not just potential life, but there's something serious going on there, I can understand why they would say no inanimate object can take priority over that, and so they would let your Lullaby burn.
Here's the reason that I think of it that way is that so obviously we don't just see human DNA as precious, because otherwise when I scratch my nose, I'm killing hundreds of skin cells that have human DNA in them. And technically, every time that you do that, it's like those are potential cells that could be cloned and turned into another me. Well, nobody thinks like that, right? It's your cells are not conscious. They're not, they don't contain some type of feelings and stuff or hopes or dreams or anything. They don't. You continue to go on. And this kind of harkens back to our episode about what makes you you. You're a collection of cells, and somewhere there's this emergent property called consciousness that happens. When you take, say, your reproductive cells, the fact that, a woman is passing an egg about every 28 days until menopause-ish, and a man is producing, billions of sperm cells, and every time that he ejaculates, it's, only potentially one of them goes on to become a baby in rare cases. Most of the time throughout the course of your life, whether it's through nocturnal emission or masturbation or sex, like you are literally having billions of sperm cells that are dying. And yet we don't give a second thought to flushing that down the toilet. And yet the second that it becomes, fertilized, it's like, well, okay, then you have an egg cell and a sperm cell. And then they've come together and you can look at the chemical components of it. You can look at the DNA. You can look at all the different aspects of it. But under no circumstances is that conscious. Under no circumstances can it feel pain or have higher levels of thought. It doesn't even have any kind of organs. And it's just a cluster of cells. So to me, it's like, I wouldn't think twice about, flushing, a Kleenex down the toilet. Why would I think twice about, there's this cluster of cells that have just been, fertilized, especially if nobody wants it. If people were like, climbing over walls to save, the sperm cells of Albert Einstein, and, that it's like the most valuable thing in the world because for some reason they think that if they clone him, they can, I don't know. It's a stupid spur of the moment analogy. That's even that is like, it's still, to me, it's like, this is something that you love, that you care about, that's a huge part of your life, and then you've got this unwanted, embryo. Yeah, I'd go with the stuffed animal.
I have one last one of these for you, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated because we're talking about like embryos and fetuses at different stages. But let's imagine, and this isn't necessarily like a trolley problem, but it's like an either or thing. But let's imagine you've got someone who hurts a woman who is, let's say, 4 weeks pregnant. Someone hurts that woman and she loses her baby because of the injury. You've also got a person who is 3 months pregnant and wants to get rid of the baby. She can legally do that. Is one worse than the other?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because one of them is the woman losing a baby under the pretext of her not wanting to lose the baby. It's forced upon her. And one is where it's of her own decision. And I don't know whether 3 months is an area where we could start talking about whether or not that baby is becoming somewhat sentient, but excluding that
it's
for
not.
now.
Higher levels of thought in the brain don't develop until about 30 weeks.
By sentient, I mean the capacity to feel pain.
So pain...
and you don't need consciousness to feel pain.
No, we spoke about this slightly in our conversation with Alex, Steve, but pain is debated to be anywhere between 18 and 24 weeks when it develops. So, yeah, no,
about 6 months in would be 24 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at 3 months, kind of 12 weeks, it wouldn't feel pain, but it would be a lot more developed than, like a 1 month old little embryo.
Yeah.
I'd have to say that under both circumstances, I still don't see it as a human yet. It's not viable. It doesn't really have any of the things that I would categorize as signature to a living human being. And so I would say that under one circumstance, he's crushing the hopes of someone, and under the other circumstance, it's an unwanted pregnancy.
Yeah. One thing I will say is at 13 weeks into pregnancy, so this is like, what's that, just over 3 months, and the little fetus already has, if it's a girl, the little fetus already has all of the eggs that it will ever have in its life.
Wow.
So it's not just holding like the potential for its own life, but for more life after that as well. Do you think that makes a difference?
I don't think it does hold the potential for life. Doesn't it require sperm?
Well, yeah.
So it's a vessel for life, that's all.
That's
it's just like saying that there's extra fertilized embryos. Extra,
but because they're not fertilized. Like we have this fertilized embryo, which has within it non-fertilized embryos, and a lot of them.
Yeah.
So, Thomas, you know a little bit about abortion laws in the US, don't you? To run over what they are in the UK. So in the UK, a woman can have an abortion up to 24 weeks into the pregnancy, as long as 2 medical professionals agree that the continuation of the pregnancy would involve risk greater than if the pregnancy was terminated to injure the physical or mental health of the pregnant woman or any existing children of her family. So that's
so she can have an abortion up to 24 months, and are you saying she can have it after that if it poses a significant health 24 weeks, 24 months? That would be an insanely long
hellish pregnancy.
It'd be like an elephant baby.
It'd be worse than that. They'll be out of the woman. It'd be like, I changed my mind.
Hasta la vista, baby.
Yeah.
No, she has to fit that criteria within the first 24 weeks. So she can't just say, I want an abortion because fun.
Wait, I
think that's fine.
In the UK, you're saying that the only way that a woman can get an abortion is if she, in the UK, is if it poses a significant health risk. She can't just go in for a medical abortion in the first 8 weeks or something, or...
No, you have to at least make a case to say that it will affect your physical or mental health. Of course, this is actually a really loose kind of thing, and you can just say, oh, I'll be really depressed if I don't have my baby, and a doctor is likely to give it to you, but, it is...
If I understand
technically there in the law to try and prevent kind of frivolous abortions.
How about if I have a baby, I'm going to be absolutely broke and bankrupt, and, people who are broke tend to be more depressed.
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Only if you add that last bit in there.
Okay.
Yeah. you it's a kind of little hoop you have to jump through.
I know quite a few people that have had abortions, and it seems to be that this is it's a paper gateway. Yeah, in the sense that really all it is they just want you to think it through, and they want you to talk with a professional who can basically say, are you really making the right decision here, or are you just doing it because your arsehole boyfriend wants you to do it, or because of pressure from worries that aren't legit. It's just they just want to make sure that the reasoning is sufficient.
I think it's an important thing to have in there, even if like you say.
As someone who lives in the States, and we have all kinds of radical religious fundamentalists who have been trying to end abortion for some time, I can see how that could easily be manipulated by a right-wing, court justice, where basically they'll say, oh, well, we're going to then force women to undergo, all kinds of health screenings to determine if there actually is a risk. And then the judge will start defining what proposes a health risk. And I think that's kind of a slippery slope. I don't know if in the UK, if you have that kind of you guys don't really have religious fundamentalists to the extent that we do, but
no, not like that. I don't think
they're not organized, not like America.
That's true. I don't think there's ever any cases in the UK where it would ever go to court like that. Do you know what I mean? There's where are my stats? I've got some numbers on the amount of abortions in the UK. In 2015, there are a total of 185,824 abortions in England and Wales. 90% of those were carried out under 13 weeks, including 80% of them under 10 weeks. So, that's a lot of what I'm trying to say is a lot of the abortions were very early on, before the baby had any hint of pain or consciousness or anything like that. It was still just a bundle of cells. But still, that's quite a big number of abortions.
Yeah.
Well, so I wanted to kind of contrast that though with the United States. And there's a really good New York Times article that juxtaposes California and Mississippi, which California it's extremely lax on the type of laws that are in place to prevent or to curtail a woman's access to an abortion, whereas Mississippi is one of the most strict states on abortion laws. And so in California, it's pretty simple. You make an appointment, you determine, how much you can cover, and, what the cost is going to be. You go in, make arrangements for, transportation, childcare, whatnot, visit the clinic, and then you have an ultrasound basically to assess your options. The doctor takes a look at it, sees how far along the pregnancy is, and lets you know whether or not you, how many weeks in you are, and what what type of procedure is required. You get some lab work done to make sure you're healthy, receive some counseling, sign a medical consent form, and you get the abortion the same day. Mm-hmm. It's really simple, in and out procedure. And there are, I want to say that there's, I forget the exact stat I was reading, but it's something like 95% of people in California have a clinic in their county or like close to them or something that's like easy to access. Mm-hmm. So, you compare that then to Mississippi, where oftentimes what happens is, even though in the US abortion has been legal since Roe versus Wade, there was a case, I think it was Planned Parenthood versus Casey in the early 90s, that went all the way to the Supreme Court, that basically said that states could make laws that put obstacles on or put different restrictions on abortion clinics, as long as it's not an undue burden on the woman seeking the procedure, which is a little bit of a gray area. But in response, what the states have been doing is they've been setting up these insane restrictions that have made it damn near impossible for clinics even to stay open. And so a lot of clinics have been completely run out of business or shut down because, these states keep coming up with new requirements that are put in place by Republicans trying to end abortion in their state. And so like some of them is one of them was that a lot of clinics or a lot of states were making it so that abortion clinics had to have admitting privileges to hospitals, which is insane because for one, according to the CDC or the Center for Disease Control, abortion-related mortality rates are 0.00073%. And a lot of hospitals, for political or religious reasons, they won't give admitting privileges to doctors who perform abortions. Yeah. And so if you don't have a hospital near you that'll do that, then you have to shut down your clinic. Also, sometimes they'll say like you have to be within a certain radius of a hospital, and they'll make the law so that it's like the radius is just outside the reach of, the nearest clinic. They'll have all kinds of restrictions in place. Sometimes they make the woman undergo a sonogram, but she has to do that the day before. She has to see it. She has to hear it. The doctor has to show it to her and show her all the different parts and stuff to kind of try to talk her out of getting the abortion.
That seems so crazy and unfair to me, because no one goes into an abortion like frivolously. No one goes in thinking, oh, this is going to be easy and fun. For most women, it's a last resort because they have no other option. For a lot of women, there's already guilt there. The fact that they're making them feel more guilty about something that is probably the best choice for them just is horrific and inhuman to me.
Yeah.
They try to traumatize them, and sometimes they'll make them like play the heartbeat or something so that they hear it. Oftentimes there'll be protesters. Protesters will stand outside of abortion clinics, and they'll have signs of like, these late-term aborted fetuses. And it's usually in most of the pictures that they get for those that I've seen are either extremely late-term miscarriages, or they are abortions that were undergone to save the life of the mother. So extreme cases, and they'll take these gruesome images and they'll be like, it's murder, you're murdering your child, and they'll traumatize the women. And so that drives up suicide rates and stuff, because women feel, like they've done something wrong. When most abortions in the US, it's like 2/3 of them are medical abortions. You go in within the first 8 weeks, you take a pill, you swallow it, and you pass a cluster of cells. Like, that's it.
Yeah.
My goal.
Don't the medical, like the medical pills and stuff basically just shed your uterine lining and the egg with it? Like,
it's something like that. I'm not sure the medical.
They basically just induce a normal period.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not even like a huge thing.
Yeah. And over 90% of abortions are done within the first trimester.
Yeah.
And so basically you go in, you do like a what do you call it? A DNC or dilation, and I think it's pronounced curettage. Where basically they'll go in and they'll just kind of like suck out or something.
I know.
And it's in the first few weeks, and so it's a very safe, extremely safe procedure, and it's in and out.
Yeah.
Honestly, the way that I see it is, if you're pro-life and you don't want this fetus to develop into 6 weeks or something, or not 6 weeks, into 6 months or something before an abortion, there should be clinics everywhere. pregnancy tests should be super easy to get a hold of. You should find out immediately, and before this develops any further, go in and take a pill. Most people who are opposed to abortion don't have a problem with the morning after pill. They don't have a problem with contraception.
How readily available is like the morning after pill in America?
You can get it at pharmacies. It costs about $50 for a for one pill, and it's about $40 for the generic knockoff brand.
Oh my god!
But it's not an effective form of birth control, and oftentimes, people's healthcare, if their healthcare plans don't cover birth control, it can be prohibitively expensive, especially for women in poverty-stricken areas. People who, of all people, can't afford to raise babies. And so, you would think that people on the right would be passing out birth control left and right, just trying to prevent people from getting pregnant. They should be passing out condoms. Instead, they'll push for abstinence-only education. They'll, tell you that condoms are ineffective and that they have a 20% failure rate, which is absolute bullshit.
No, they don't.
and instead they'll say like, oh, you should just wait till marriage. And which is insane, because you're taking people in poverty-stricken areas who, like, their life is already miserable. Their life is already hell, and yet that you're telling them that they can't have the one form of free stress relief and pleasure and stuff, have someone that they love, that that they want to sleep with, that they want to be intimate with, and you're saying you can't do that, you have to wait, and maybe they're not ready to get married, maybe they don't know each other well enough. People are people, we have hormones and stuff.
Yeah, that's no help at all to like people who have suffered like sexual assault and rape and stuff either.
Yeah,
like that's no help at all to them.
Or incest.
Those people,
if they're a 13-year-old girl, gets impregnated by her dad or something.
Yeah. Those people need to know where they can go and get easy, free, cheap access to things like morning after pills and STD tests. They need that.
Yeah. So to contrast California's laws with Mississippi, basically in Mississippi, these prohibitive laws have made it so impossible for clinics to stay open that the entire state only has one abortion clinic open still. And so if a woman has to travel, she has to, all the way across the state to the one clinic. And then usually, like, some of these laws basically make the woman first come in for an appointment, and then she has to wait between 24 and 72 hours. A lot of states have waiting periods between when you first see the doctor and when you can get an abortion. So if she's traveling from out of state, she's got to or from across the state, she has to get a hotel room. She has to, set up travel expenses. She's got to, take time off work. Maybe she has kids already and she has to, get daycare and stuff. And so you're doing all of this. And then sometimes if the clinics are only open on certain days, you may have to come back. You may have to make several trips. It might take you weeks from the initial visit until when you can finally go in and get it, just because of, your own schedule and stuff. And at the same time, then some of them make it so bad to where, like, I'll just read through these. So the state has only one clinic. Doctors are only available a few days a week, and only OBGYNs can perform abortion, whereas in California, nurse practitioners and others can perform most abortions, and they can literally just, if you're prescribed the pills, you can take in like the first 8 weeks. If you're on Medicare, you basically, none of it is covered, and so you have to pay for it completely out of pocket. And which, if you think economically, like, the woman is going to have to pay way more for a child, and it's going to be a much bigger tax burden than an abortion or birth control.
This reminds me a lot of when abortion was illegal in Ireland, which was literally up until a couple of months ago, and you would have people literally coming across on like the ferry to the UK to try and get abortions, and they'd like have to book days off work to do it, and they'd have to stay in hotels, and it was just like an absolute stress for them. It was horrific. I read so many articles from women saying that they'd done it and how it was the best thing for them and the best choice in the long run, but the whole process was so traumatic because they couldn't even have their family or friends with them because it costs like so much to come over here and do it, and it was just it's heartbreaking.
So then, this one pisses me off. In Mississippi and 25 other states, it requires a parental consent for a minor who seeks an abortion. So imagine if you have a pro-life shitbag father who rapes you and gets you pregnant and then says that you have to carry this thing to term.
Does Mississippi have any kind of rules that would make that a special case?
There's one thing you can do. You can obtain a court order allowing for an abortion without parental involvement. But imagine if you're a 13-year-old kid, you've got to know this. You have to research it. You have to figure out where the court is, how to get to a court if you don't even have a driver's license, how to get a court order. You know, you don't have a lawyer, you can't afford it. You're in the poorest state in the US. Mississippi is dirt poor, and 25 other states require this as well. So you have to bring a photo ID with you. A lot of kids don't have photo IDs yet. So you have to go and apply for a passport. You're too young to have a driver's license.
All of these loopholes are bizarre. You can just tell that despite the fact that the law is what it is, it really isn't, because you can completely kern it with all these additional loopholes, which is where they do have the reins, and make it as impossible as basically not having the liberty to do so. That's very sad. That's very sad, and that's a serious issue.
I'm not even halfway through this. I'll try to blow through it real quick so we don't take up the whole podcast time. But they have to travel then to Jackson, Mississippi, where the clinic is. 91% of women in Mississippi live in a county that doesn't have a clinic. Then they have to get the ultrasound. The provider will ask if you want to see it, receive a copy of it, or hear the heartbeat. Because in 26 states, abortion legislation includes provisions about ultrasound. It's required. They have to ask the patient if they want to see the image. If it shows you're more than 16 weeks pregnant, you have to go out of state for the abortion, because even though it's legal federally to do it at 20 weeks, there's so many different licensing regulations and stuff in Mississippi that there's not a single clinic that will do it after 16 weeks. Then you have to get lab work done.
There's got to be a reason for that. Because like in the UK, it's 24 weeks, because up until that point, after that point, they kind of like assume, like scientifically, that the fetus is viable outside of the womb, as in it could survive outside the womb after 24 weeks. So that's why that law's in place in the UK. But why 16? Like nothing too special happens at that point.
I think because...
Could it be
because it's based off of the licensing type? It's probably the different types of procedures that you can only do up to a certain point.
Okay, yeah.
Also, like just something I wanted to throw in is that I really do think it's arbitrary to draw the line at it can survive outside of the womb. So it could be that they draw the line at this is where you get the presence of pain receptors, but not the capacity for pain itself, because they're separate.
Well,
that could be an arbitrary line where they draw it.
As it happens, like it is kind of in line with the pain receptors. Like there's a chance they'll have it a couple of weeks before that, but not necessarily. And so to make up for it, a lot of places now have a law where if you want to get an abortion after 18 weeks, they have to give the fetus pain medication just in case it can feel. Like
okay, cool.
Yeah, like an anesthetic essentially.
So just to I'm still on Mississippi's insane laws. Like it's mind-boggling. So then
this makes me so happy to live in the UK though.
The medical doctors,
the UK is pretty liberal.
They literally they're required to provide medical health information that is inaccurate to the patients. So one of the things that they're required to state is that there's an association between abortion and breast cancer. This has been disproven in the same way, like to the same extent that vaccines cause autism has been disproven. Like this, there is no link that has ever been shown between abortion and breast cancer. And yet the state, the legislators make it so that the doctors have to say that. So the doctors will tell you, we're required by law to tell you that it increases your chance of breast cancer. But my honest medical opinion based off of all the research is that that's absolute bullshit. And
that's ridiculous.
Then you sign a medical consent form. If you're a minor, your parent must be present to sign the consent form too. Signing the form begins a 24-hour waiting period in Mississippi. Some states have up to 72 hours that you have to wait. So you're literally having to wait days just, from signing a form until you can go and get a pill. Then you make a second appointment for another day. But oftentimes it takes women a lot longer because, they have to work out their schedules and come back. Then they make arrangements for transportation, childcare, time off again, return to the clinic. If you're a minor, your parent must accompany you again, and then you get the abortion. And some states make it so that even if you're just taking a pill, you have to make an appointment with your doctor just to come in and take the second pill, which is nuts. God. Like this shit should be like almost just over the counter. Like, all right, well, you took an ultrasound, you got a positive pregnancy test, you're within the first 8 weeks, here's your pill. Like, maybe not over the counter, but like it should be extremely easy to access.
Like the
UK. This is ridiculous. Everyone knows that the earlier abortions are carried out, the safer they are, the more like painless they are, the fewer complications there are. Like, to stretch it out just because like you're like, I don't know if you should be doing that.
The less developed the fetus is.
Yeah,
so It's like, if you're really worried that at some point, most people, sane people, would look at a sperm and an egg cell and say, okay, that's not a human being, right? And then once it becomes fertilized, most people would say, okay, it's a cluster of cells. Somewhere along that process, going from that to delivering a child, something happens, and there's an emergent property of consciousness, of humanity. The argument is not over whether or not, even the hard problem of consciousness, the problem is not over whether or not consciousness comes from the brain. The problem is how that happens. So when this thing doesn't have a brain, that's when we know it's not conscious. It doesn't have a mind. It's not living. It's not a human. And so the question is...
Do you require consciousness to be a human?
Yes.
Really?
Well, you require some form of a mind. If you don't, you're literally... That's why...
That's a different thing, though. So mind, yes. But I just... Perhaps it's not the right time for me to point it out, but I just don't think consciousness is necessary.
Well, okay, not consciousness in the sense that, like, if you're unconscious or you're asleep, obviously you're still a human.
Just to throw this out there as like a little fact for you guys while we debate this, most sources believe that the consciousness and the bits of the brain that allow consciousness only develop in fetuses after 23 weeks. So before then, it's hard to say whether it's like human in the sense that it can think, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So does that have an impact on either of you? Like the whole...
It certainly has an impact. I don't know if thinking is the same as consciousness either. Consciousness is about being aware. It's about being able to pass the mirror test, if I'm not mistaken. It's about understanding.
Well, the mirror test doesn't... Babies don't pass it until a couple years in.
Yeah, so I guess if you was to define consciousness in that way, then it's really not going to be conscious at all during its entire take inside the womb. But yeah, all of these facts, all of these faculties, this is where things get heavier for me, and where I find it harder to draw the line, and I draw the line at a different place to most people. But I do continue. I mean, from what you've just made clear there, Thomas, I don't think you need to say any more. Mississippi is an absolute fucking joke. That is abysmal. That is absolutely terrible. And it's a good example of where the law says one thing, but the practice of it, because it's in the hands of people that don't abide by that law, is disgusting. It's just completely not coherent. And that should be against the United States.
For people who say they care about human life and like wanting to protect these unborn babies and stuff, they clearly have no respect for the lives of the women who are going through it.
It's also, as soon as they're born, disgusting. They don't want to like throw tax or whatnot towards them to actually. It's like, we'll make sure you're born into a suffering life, but then you're on your own.
Yeah.
It's like, who do you think you are?
It's like, how many babies have they adopted?
Yeah. I was going to say, this might be a good point to address the whole pile of sand analogy. Because we were talking about, like, different stages and at what point it becomes a human. So, Thomas, I know you've seen this, and Steve, you were there as well.
I was.
But Alex O'Connor, Cosmic Skeptic, argued with us that a fetus is essentially a lot like a grain of sand turning into a pile of sand. And these grains of sand build up, and like, when does it become a heap? Was his argument. So it's like, oh, we can't pinpoint when it becomes a human. I would argue, and I think you're on the same page as me, Steve, that it's entirely different, because when it comes to a fetus growing into a baby, there are lots and lots of different stages. It's not just adding another grain to the pile. Cells are specializing. We're getting special organs. We're getting organelles in there. Where like things become functional. I think the analogy I made in my video was that it's more like a burrito. It's like, you get some rice and you get some meat and you get some veg and you wrap it all up. Like, individually, those things aren't a burrito. It's only when it all comes together. So, I was wondering, do you guys have any thoughts on that, essentially, that whole thing? Because I think it is a very important point to talk about, because a lot of people agreed with Alex, surprisingly.
Well, I think as far as the philosophical element of it goes, which is we don't know, and you can represent the lack of knowledge via the concept of the heap, because when is it a heap? This is valid, like, but it's bypassing the more important question, which you were alluding to, which is why do we give a fuck? Like, at what point does this matter, and what specific attributes is it that matters? So, for example, does consciousness matter? I don't think it does, but others would say yes. Does well-being matter? I think that's the key point. A lot of people don't. Some people say, can it survive outside of the womb? That's when it's a human. So I pressed Alex and I said, well, what is a human? And he couldn't give me an answer. And I said, well, is a chimp a human? And he said, well, I don't know. And I think that illustrates the point where it's okay to say we don't know, but we have to draw the line somewhere with the knowledge that we have. And this is where you'll get discrepancies between where people will draw the line when it comes to abortion, because that's what they define as human. And most people think that human should, by default, enjoy the freedoms of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I personally don't think it's a human thing. I think it should be a being thing, which is why I don't eat meat, for example. I think as soon as something can feel pain, we just don't try not to hurt it. It's that simple. But I think that's where I stand on that kind of line of reasoning.
So I feel like philosophy without science is bullshit. It's like having valid logic with unsound premises. So, for example,
I love you a little bit, Thomas.
I can say, a perfectly logically valid argument. I can say all humans are puppies. Rachel is a human, therefore Rachel is a puppy.
I knew it.
Okay. But the fact is that even though it's logically valid, it's built with unsound premises. Obviously, all humans are not puppies. Obviously, Alex knows the difference between a human and a chimpanzee, and it's half a chromosome difference. Yeah, we're very genetically similar.
But he wouldn't say that.
If you threw up a bunch of pictures and you asked him which one's the human, he would be lying if he said he couldn't tell, if he couldn't spot which one was the person. And we all know it.
Have you seen some people? They're quite hairy.
So the fact that, it takes science for us to pinpoint what separates a human from other animals. We look at the genetic information, we look at the DNA, we look at the abilities, we look at the mind, what parts of the brain are different. We look at, the different characteristics that set us apart. We don't value all we don't value all life the same way. We eat animals, for example. Obviously, Steve, you don't. But societally, we do. And it's not frowned upon to the same way as if we were eating babies.
No.
Certainly not.
Yeah.
You go back 200 years ago, slavery wasn't frowned upon.
But I know we can get into the morality of eating animals, but my point is that as a society right now, it's not all life that we care about. It's human life. And the question is, at what point does it become a human? You can stack up a bunch of grains of sand and say, oh, eventually it becomes a heap. Well, I could say that same argument. Okay, we're just a cluster of cells, of human cells. At what point does going from one cell to a cluster make it a human? Well, it depends on the cells. I could take one skin cell and I could pile up a stack from here to the moon, and it's just a cluster of skin cells. It's not a human being.
Yeah, exactly.
It's how they're arranged, how they're specialized, the types of cells that are used. And so until someone can demonstrate to me any example of a living human being that lacked a brain, that was able to survive, that was able to function, and that actually is, a human being, then until they can do that, then I think that they have all their work cut out for them to showcase that there's a cluster of cells inside of a woman's body that is a human being.
I think the well-being factor comes into it as well, not just in the sense of feeling pain, like you said, Steve, but in the potential for well-being in the future. So for me, it just being a human life or not isn't really enough. I need to know that it's going to have a good life. I definitely value quality of life over quantity, which is something I said before. But I think
but who are you? Just because you'll help me clarify what you're asking. Who are you to make such a decision? over someone who may be potentially born? Because I understand that you have that preference, but what about the preference of that
I don't necessarily mean it
unborn?
in regards to everyone else. I mean it in regards to like my own body.
Sure. So are you
Does that
only
make
really?
sense?
Yeah. So are you
Yeah.
Can
merely
I
expressing a
jump in
preference, or?
in response to Steve?
Yeah. No, totally. Yeah, I'm curious of this.
And I don't want to steal it away from Rachel because I
No,
know
it's
you're
okay.
leading this episode, but
It's okay.
one statistic a lot of people don't realize is, and I forget the exact numbers, but I want to say it's about 20% of all fertilized eggs never implant. It might be higher. It might be closer to 50% or
It's
something.
a hell of a lot, yeah.
The numbers, I don't want to get lost in the details, but we're looking at millions and millions and millions and millions of fertilized embryos that never implant.
Yeah.
Like
A huge amount
they're
of women
fertilized.
a huge amount of women are pregnant and miscarry before they even realize it.
Yeah, well, then once they implant, I want to say it's like 30 to 50% or something that spontaneously miscarry. I might be getting the two mixed up. It might be that one is 20% and the other is 50%. It makes no difference to my overall argument. My argument is if the moment that a child is conceived, if all of a sudden, we realize that that is a human. This is a human being that has been, it's been fertilized and a soul is in this thing. We have to really defend this and protect it. Well, all of a sudden we're looking at something that like this kills more human beings, miscarriage and, non-implantation. Like it kills more human beings than cancer and AIDS and, heart disease and everything put together. Like this is, the greatest killer of all times. Why are we not expending all of our resources, all of our money, to bring that rate down and to make sure that no miscarriages ever take place?
Sorry, just so I understand, did you say once it's born, you say this is a human, and then you say that this kills more humans than?
No, I'm playing the devil's advocate here.
Yeah, no, he was saying like once, if people think that like life begins at conception.
Yes, okay, yeah, I understand.
If you make that assumption and you say life begins at conception, all of a sudden you're dealing with the greatest killer of human life in existence.
Yeah.
We're looking at every single year, hundreds of millions of non-implanted, fertilized embryos and miscarriages that are happening all around the world. This should be the greatest disaster. People are putting together these huge things to prevent and to put an end to breast cancer, which, is a much, much, much smaller killer. And yet nobody's batting an eye over this. It's just, it doesn't align. It doesn't match up if they actually believe this.
Wouldn't the pro-lifers, I don't know any pro-life advocates that say that just the passing of an egg is a form of abortion or is a form of...
No, we're talking about a fertilized
so it can only once fertilized, that's when it's... Yeah, okay, cool, yeah.
But the point is that like only a tiny percent of fertilized eggs are even like noticed as you being pregnant, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. I hope I don't seem obtuse or deliberately provocative here. I'm just trying to understand
That's fine.
The circumstances. So
keep going. I don't mind.
Yeah, and I'm being a little bit a little bit edgy, just playing the devil's advocate for the sake of showcasing a few holes in the argument.
Well, can I ask you both a question? I'll ask you first, Rachel. I think you gave me largely the answer, but it'd be good to say it again because I think you gave it to me when I was talking with Alex and you. But what is a human? When does it become human?
It is a tough one. So for me, I tend to look mostly at the biology, and I think when it has a consciousness and can feel pain, that's when it becomes human. But I also do like to take into account when it can survive outside the womb, which is becoming earlier and earlier as our technology advances, which is why I think perhaps the UK needs to readdress its 24-week rule and perhaps bring it back to 20 weeks. I'm not sure.
Cool.
But another thing for me is, and I know I keep saying it, but these labels that we attach to things, like, if you do have a tiny, 2-week-old embryo, and you want that to be your baby, and you love that little thing, then why shouldn't it be human just because it doesn't have a consciousness yet, or because it doesn't have, I don't know, like fingernails yet? Like, if you apply that label to what's inside you, then sure, it can be human. But I think it gets tricky when people try and start applying those labels to other people's bodies when you don't have the science to back it up. Does that make sense?
It does. If I could press you a little.
Yeah, of course.
When you say that it becomes human when it has pain receptors and perhaps can survive outside of the womb, why doesn't that apply to animals? Because they feel pain.
That's a really good point. Well, it's kind of combined with our DNA as well then in that case. Because I would say, you know, like a little puppy embryo becomes a puppy once it gets consciousness and pain receptors. It's the combination of the DNA and the features. That gets a little difficult, like more difficult when you start looking at like non-mammals. Like you could say, you know, when does a bird become a bird? But I don't know enough about bird physiology to kind of go into that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that satisfies my answer. But it does. It leaves me with one final one to push you on.
Yeah, go on.
Because it's helping me understand your position. I think it's coherent. Okay. But you've put rightfully a lot of concern on the female and the parents, but particularly the female, whether or not she wants the baby, because it is a massive difference in her life, you know. Yeah. And you've explained the reasons succinctly. You've explained them sufficiently. But it seems for me, and I want to know if this is the same for you, all of those concerns are of pretty much the only priority until that clump of cells, that fetus, that embryo becomes something that is, as you've just defined, as human. At that point, there is for me a complete switch over where about 95% of the concern falls down onto the human, and only 5% for the mother and for all other external factors, essentially. Which is not me saying that, you know, oh, it's going to affect her health. Of course, you know, you must abort, and there is obviously circumstances. But for me, then it becomes a human, and then the social contract of life being one of the things that you must ensure for humans is of absolute priority. Do you have the same significant switch, or do you then go 50-50, say, or how does it work for you?
That is a really tough one.
Wait, why does it go straight from 95 to 5?
Okay, so do you want me to answer that, or do you want to answer first, Rachel?
No, go on, you answer, and I'll have a little think about how I want to word this.
For me, it's because it is a clump of cells until it can feel pain. The second it can feel pain, then you're talking about a being. To me, it doesn't matter that it's human; it's a being. Then there's some serious concern. The fact that it's inconvenient for me.
You think that that's a binary point, though?
What do you mean by? It's not entirely binary, but it essentially is. And the reason
like if it has one nerve and it can feel a tiny sensation of feeling.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes. No, I don't think it's binary in that sense. And I think that the real questions of what level of well-being, what level of sentience is where we should really be putting the research to ask. Put it this way. I think that, let's just say it develops this capacity to feel pain, and over the next week, it goes from there is no pain reception to that of a rat. Let's just arbitrarily say that's the case. Within that week, that priority from the mother to the child would switch in coherence with that development.
So if you completely numb the pain receptors of the fetus, then it's no longer a human and you can abort it. But up until that, if you don't, then it's...
No, I would say that's as fallacious as saying if you completely numb the feelings of a human, they're no longer a human. You know, as in an adult.
But if you have a human being who has leprosy or something and they can't feel sensations in their arm, is it okay to chop their arm off?
I would say it's not, because it's not that simple. in that circumstance, because there's many more faculties to consider. For example, that being still has psychological well-being, and that is arguably very significant.
I don't understand how pain reception is where you draw the line. And the reason I get at that is you were asking what makes it a human. Obviously, it's not arms and legs because we value the lives of quadriplegics. Yep. Obviously, it's not your kidneys because you can donate one of those and we don't consider someone half a kidney. It's not your heart because you can get a heart transplant and replace it and we don't consider it you becoming a new human. It's not pain reception because you can completely numb all your sensation of pain and we still value the person. It's not even just consciousness because you can have someone go into a coma and we still value the person.
Hang on, about the pain reception. Yeah. You can numb someone. What about their capacity to feel psychological pain?
Well, but that's different because that's an aspect.
It's in the same area of sentience. It's in the same.
What
area
I'm saying,
of
sorry, let me clarify. It's not your pain receptors that make you human. It's the processing of it that goes on in the mind, and that's where I say, like, to me, it all comes back to it is our minds that make us. Now, you can say that we don't just have one brain, that we've got our gut, all the different, sensations and nerves in our gut and all the different chemicals that are firing there, and that we're getting all this feedback from all throughout our body. Yes, human beings are incredibly complicated. But you get rid of the brain, you get rid of sentience, sapience, consciousness, the ability to feel any kind of pain. Like, without the brain's ability to process it, we're not human. And I think that's kind of a no-brainer.
Yes, but that's not a human distinctive property. All mammals have brains.
But no, all mammals don't have human brains. There are parts of the brain that are very distinct to human. And so to me, whether or not the argument isn't right now over whether or not it's okay to kill an animal. And I would say that for that argument, it's like, how complicated is the brain? What functions, what types of brain function do they have? It becomes less and less and less moral the higher levels of thought an animal is able to undergo.
So
that's why we don't think
that you put it on.
Well, the higher level of mental processing.
Because the brain is such a complex system. And there's many areas you can emphasize. If it's thinking, then that's where you're going to draw the line. When does the fetus be able to think? But then you have to remain consistent. If it shows that there is some thinking happening at 6 weeks, that's where you've got to draw your line.
It's 24 to the 20 between the 24th and 27th week of pregnancy that the large scale neuronal linking starts to occur. Because if you don't have the brain matter that specifically the gray matter that's being formed in our cerebral cortex, that's where all of our higher level thought occurs. And so
I see, because I'm reading here that just 4 weeks after conception, the baby's brain and spinal cord will develop.
No, the parts that will form into the brain, that will form into the brain start to develop. But
yes,
it takes roughly 100 billion neurons to start constituting the material basis of thought.
Yes.
And so when the neurons start to link up and start processing and stuff, that's about 24 to 27 weeks in, which is about the 6th month.
So to bring us back on track, do you think me putting emphasis on well-being is as arbitrary as say someone saying when it can survive outside the womb? That's to you, Thomas.
No, I honestly, I think that viability, to me, it's like, yeah, it no longer affects the woman as much because it can survive outside the womb. But I think that in itself is a little bit of a flawed argument, simply because imagine that if it did, and I'm not saying that it does, but if it did develop, consciousness and thought and sentience and sapience and everything, and it was surviving inside of the mother's womb, but it was just like in a coma or something, and it just needed a little bit more nutrients, then it's like, well, at that point, it'd be a fully developed human life that, or not a fully developed. Obviously, it doesn't have the ability to survive. It's still developing, and even kids continue to develop into adulthood. So that's probably a bad choice of words, but I don't think that viability necessarily is, other than the fact that it no longer affects the woman as much if it's able to survive outside of the womb.
I think putting it all down to like one factor or another is overly simplistic. I think we need to look at a whole bunch of things, including brain function, including viability, including pain. There's no point looking at one thing instead of another. You need to look at it all together, because all fetuses, again, do develop at slightly different rates from each other. So while one might have such and such a feature at 18 weeks, another might not get that until 20. You need to look at the fetus individually to see kind of like how far along it is when we're talking about those, not necessarily late stage abortions, but late in legal terms. For me, it's like, imagine you had a person in kind of like a coma or like on life support, and you're deciding whether to turn off the machine or not. Just because they have certain things functioning, like maybe, I don't know, maybe their lungs still work or something still works, but they're completely brain dead or they're completely this or whatever. Like you need to look at a lot of different things before you decide whether to turn a machine off on someone. And I think you need to do the same thing when deciding if a fetus is human or not. You can't just say, can it feel pain or not? You have to say, can it feel pain? And does it have this level of brain activity? Can it do this? Can it do this? And so on. Does that make sense? Or is that kind of...
It makes sense, and I agree, and I do agree with you. Some of what you said just made me think. There's just another question to you, Rachel. I think you're right about saying that a human is development of well-being, particularly, or as you said, there's many things, but particularly well-being, and the DNA of human. But what would be wrong with me saying that a human is only Caucasian, or we should only care about Caucasian humans? Obviously, I wouldn't say this is nonsense, but I could say, well, it's a Caucasian human when you can tell that the DNA is Caucasian and you can see that the well-being's developed. To me, it's almost speciesism. I was just curious how that gels.
I agree. Like I agree in the point you're trying to make, in that I think that would be wrong, and that's why we can apply a lot of the same principles that we're talking about here to animals and stuff. But again, I think you get a kind of difference when it comes to the emotional attachments we have to the things within our own bodies. Like, like, I'm happy to eat a pig, but if I had a pet pig, I wouldn't want to eat it. Just like, if I was pregnant right now, I don't think I could keep it because I wouldn't have that emotional attachment to it. But maybe if I get pregnant in 5 years, I will.
Yeah,
is this the point you're trying to make? Am I getting this?
I think what's happening is I come at this from a fundamentally different view to most people. Most people care about what's human, and that's where the line must be drawn. Where I don't care what a human is. I just care about, can something feel pain? I don't care whether I fell out of the vagina of a pig or a human or a cockroach. It's just I would just don't want to be in an environment wherever the luck put me. I was in a situation where no rights at all were given to me simply because of something that's arbitrary. But I'm not trying to make this. Yeah,
Steve,
I'm not.
Am I mischaracterizing your point in that you don't want to cause or inflict any kind of suffering on anything?
I think that would be a fairly succinct way of putting it. It's like we find ourselves on this earth and we figure out that there's no God. We figure out that the universe wasn't created with us in mind, and we have to make our own purpose. But the fact of the matter is that when we die, we die. And so what this boils down to is that life is suffering and then we die. So it seems to me that if there's any duty, if there's any reasonable argument to be brought out of this, it is, let's make it so that the situation isn't as shit as it currently is for everything that can feel pain. So I'm not trying to make this a conversation about animal well-being, but I realise that I necessarily am, because I don't draw the line at human, and that's where I'm just trying to figure out the answers to. And you've answered them. Can I possibly
make a suggestion then? Because while you're kind of asking like what makes something human, when does something become human, and then you're saying like when does it feel pain? Maybe instead of that, we should be asking when does it become an individual? Because then that can apply to all animals and living things as well.
Yes, and that's what I ask. Personally, that's what I do. So for me, it's like, what makes an individual an individual? Why should we care at all? And I find that the most coherent argument tends to be rooted in well-being. Whereas
and for a full deep answer to this, go listen to our "What Makes You You" episode.
Yeah. No, I definitely find myself like agreeing with a lot of the things you say, Steve. And I do kind of wish I could follow through on what I know is the right way of thinking, if that makes sense. Like, I definitely have it's a bit of a bad thing, but I find that while I can sort of objectively recognize that something like a pig is an individual or a chicken is an individual, I find I can distance myself from it when I want to eat, which makes me kind of like morally bad and ethically bad, but it makes life a little bit more practical. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course.
Well,
of course it does. Of course it makes sense. But I feel like the
Is a
same's
slime
done with
mold
abortion.
an individual?
Oh.
Sorry, say again?
Is a slime mold an individual?
Depends how pretty it is.
It behaves as one unit, but it's a bunch of individual, little lives that are all meshed together, or a colony of bees that will behave as one organism almost, and have certain roles that they carry out and communicate with each other, just like our body communicates with different parts of our body, and they can change roles depending on
I think when it comes to like the things like slime, then we have to start asking about things like pain as well. Because when we had the vegetarian-vegan debate, Steve, I found myself somehow like falling down this rabbit hole where I was like thinking, oh god, but how far do we take this? Technically, plants are living things. And then I had to get to a point where I was like, no, you're being stupid.
Yeah,
they
plant
don't
doesn't
feel
matter. It doesn't
pain.
matter. Yeah, that's all. Honestly, like I know vegans, for example, that would say, what matters is that it's alive. It's like, no, it doesn't. Living doesn't matter at all. And it's the same reason why a fetus doesn't matter. Sorry, an embryo doesn't matter. It might be living. It's living tissue. There's no pain reception, so I don't give any crap towards it.
If you have a genetic disease where you can't feel pain and you're emotionally very, I guess monotone is a bad descriptor, but if let's say that you lack the emotions, you lack the neurochemistry required to feel strong feelings about anything one way or the other, and you also lack any kind of pain receptors, but you're absolutely like Stephen Hawking level brilliant, would it still be morally wrong would that person be considered an individual simply because they have no way of suffering or feeling pain?
So I don't know about individual, but my answer would be yes. I can explain why, but I feel like I may have detracted already just by asking those questions. But I did it for me. It was interesting to see where that went. So thank you, Rachel and Thomas. But it's up to you, Rachel, where we go from here. If you want me to answer that question, I can. If you've got other things you'd like to cover, then
no, I'm happy actually. I'm quite interested in your answer.
Sure. So
yeah, go ahead.
To clarify your question, Thomas, are you saying that this individual can't feel any physical pain, or
they can't feel any physical, emotional, or psychological pain?
So they can't feel any pain whatsoever.
Yeah. So they're going through life, and they're basically
so they're a psychopath that can't feel.
They're like
any physical
a leper.
Pain.
Who's a psychopath who has, they're very apathetic about everything in the world, and they're just very like meh.
And your question
to an extreme level, like they cannot have any sense of pain, but they're brilliant, absolutely super intelligent, and they have friends and family who love them. They have, they're integrated into society. Are they considered an individual simply because they lack this one characteristic?
When it comes to...
Can I just ask a clarification there? When you say they can't feel anything, do you mean like on a conscious level? Because like to be able to function at any level, you need to be able to like, feel where things are in the world and like have a sense of like touching things. But
they're not able to suffer. They're not able to suffer. Their senses work, but they're not able to suffer at all.
Okay. Sorry, go on, Steve.
It's an interesting point you raised there. It might be that if you did have a being that cannot suffer at all, it might necessarily be that it isn't conscious and that it can't feel anything. But at the very least, we can entertain this as a philosophical hypothetical, and that works. Do you remember one of the first questions that Rachel asked about essentially that even though there's a clump of cells and we don't attribute any kind of agency or specificities of caring about it to the cells itself, it may affect somebody around them quite profoundly, such as the mother. Like if the mother wanted the child and and you stood on the cells, that's going to do some real damage, despite the fact that the cells themselves aren't real. You could argue that that's the same case when it comes to this individual. If you was to if you want to call it an individual, if you was to incinerate this individual or this person or this thing, if you was to mistreat that individual, you will necessarily hurt, as you said, the people that love that person, and you will hurt them quite profoundly, probably irreversibly. So you could
you're saying
appeal
it's
to
the
theirs.
suffering of this, but okay, what if let's take it a step further? It's a hermit, and
Yes.
there's no suffering whatsoever that will ever occur. It's not, even a question of, is it okay to kill this person? It's just a question of, is this an individual? Is this a valuable life?
What do you mean by valuable life? Just because I'm not quite following what you mean by valuable life.
So we've been trying to figure out at what point does a fetus become a human individual life, a person. At what point is it okay or not okay? Obviously, before a certain point, before 30 weeks of pregnancy, it doesn't have the regular typical brain patterns signature to an adult human. It's not able to think, but it develops pain receptors and the ability to feel pain before that. So you can argue from a suffering standpoint that it's not okay to abort. Now you can say, is it okay to abort if you give it anesthetics or something? That's a whole nother avenue. But I'm kind of taking this to an extreme case where you have a human being who they have everything that is signature to human beings. They've got all the same organs. They've got a brain that's fully functioning. It's highly developed, a super massive IQ and a super massive EQ. And they're just this brilliant individual. They have a huge amount of potential that they could contribute to society, but they don't have any connections. No one would really, know if they died. No one, all their family's gone. They don't really have any friends, and they can't feel any kind of pain or suffering. Is that still someone I would argue that has potential value to society? And I would also argue that they are an individual, that they're a human being, and that that's a human life. I'm not sure if you agree with me.
I think it gets difficult when we start talking about potential for life, because a lot of things have a lot of potential. Like, I know it sounds really stupid, but let's bring it back to Lullaby and the whole stuffed lamb thing. If one of you guys came up and threw her on a fire, I would start crying and you guys would feel really bad about it. But now imagine you went and burnt a random stuffed animal in a shop, that no one had ever loved or cuddled. Would you feel bad about it?
Does this lamb have
I'd reimburse the person that I stole it from, but yes, it's all about that sentimental value.
Yeah.
The reason I would feel bad.
But that lamb has the potential to, that other one from the shop or whatever, that has the potential to go on and make a child very happy, or an adult.
Yes, yeah.
It has the potential. So are you taking that potential away?
And if Apathy Bob here, let's say that he doesn't provide any value to human life, maybe all he does is he sits in a cave and he eats beans, and he has a little bean garden out front, and he just harvests beans and eats them.
Sounds like a great life.
And he sits there. Hurting anyone. He sits there and he just philosophically thinks about things all day. Is he still? He's still a human being, is he not?
He is. What I'm struggling with here is the idea of something being able to actually function in the ways that you're describing, while not having the attributes that you're necessarily saying it doesn't have. I don't actually think that could happen. I'm not entirely sure why. I think you require the things that you've stripped this individual off in order to actually have the capacities that you say that this individual has. Does that make sense?
I mean, part of it is a suspension of disbelief, but I'm thinking that you can lose all of your physical sensations, and I would think that the brain would start to go crazy. And I do know that oftentimes our brains develop defense mechanisms where they will shut off certain aspects in order to maintain sanity. And so if your brain is able to, cope with this by, getting rid of any kind of emotional pain and suffering, and just become extremely apathetic or psychopathic, then I think in theory that apathy Bob is a potential dude.
I feel like at this point, though, like, what's really the difference between how he's behaving and how a plant behaves? Both have an impact on their environment, but...
Plants can't think.
Okay, but he can think.
But if... Would he have consciousness under this rubric? Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, yeah, I guess if he's got consciousness, that's the big part of what makes him an individual then, right?
From an outsider's perspective, from us looking in, he just looks like a normal cave-dwelling being.
I think you've nailed it there, Rachel, actually. I think you're right. I think individuality is tethered to consciousness. Really, when you really get down to it. But that's not necessarily what makes something a human, which means you potentially can have this avenue where you can have a human that's not an individual. I think that's actually probably a situation which could occur. But I think you're right. An individual probably necessarily has to be conscious.
Wait, it seems like you've made kind of a binary statement of what makes a person a human, and I think it's a much more of a gradient. Human characteristics, that are leveled on top of.
I see. What did I say exactly, so I can clarify that?
You were saying that without these abilities, that it wouldn't be humanhood, or it wouldn't be like a.
It seems like the one thing that we are definite. Well, we actually agree on a hell of a lot, but one thing that we very much agreed upon is that although we are so desperately wanting a simple answer, there is no simple answer. And what makes a human is, there's multiple faculties to be considered: well-being, consciousness, thinking, but perhaps potentiality, etc., etc. So I think that the definition of human falls somewhere within the realm of all that mess. But for me, it doesn't matter, because I don't care about whether or not we're human. I just care about well-being. So that's where that emphasis would come from. That's a problem for people that care about humans and not other species. That's your problem. That's your burden to figure that out. It's not mine, if that makes sense. So I agree with you. It's really hard to define human. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that a chimp isn't a human.
Well, I would say that humans are still apes, and that we fall within that same classification. But as far as if you get down to the species level, Homo sapiens,
no, I agree. That's why I use chimp as well. But yeah.
Just before we finish, because this is getting a long episode, I did want to talk briefly about the kind of social stuff, if that's okay. Because the amount of kids who are currently in care is ridiculous. The amount of a burden that is on the economy, I don't want to say I don't want to make burden sound like a bad thing, but there is a hell of a lot of an economic strain because of the amount of kids currently in care. Yeah, there's a lot of strain because of the amount of parents who need support. There's a lot of strain of parents who can't afford to have children having to claim child support. Basically, the amount of children people are having is a huge, huge strain on the economy. It's easy for people to say, oh, well, the abortion debate doesn't affect this because whether those kids are born and cost money or not, doesn't matter morally. It's very easy to say that, but I disagree. I think if you're going to make the argument that abortion is wrong, or that certain people shouldn't have abortions, you need to follow through with that and say, what do we do instead? You need to say, how do we support all those kids who are going to be born? Those 185,000 babies that would have been born in 2015. What do we do with them? Where do we house them? Who looks after them? How do we pay child support for a huge portion of them? Where do we educate them? You need to come up with those answers.
It's a very legitimate consequentialist argument that you raised there. And as you rightfully point out, it's just the result is really significant. And you can't just say, you can't be deontological here and say, nope, you can't have an abortion after X, and then ignore the necessary problems that arise, because they're not always due to incompetency of the parents. Condoms fail, education fails, the capacity to actually get somewhere to take the morning after pill fails. Why? Because of corrupt politicians and corrupt infrastructure. These aren't the faults of the individuals, and we can't pretend that it is and put all of that burden on them. So I think,
we make birth control prohibitively expensive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the way you were describing that, Thomas. It just made me think about how you have the Democratic Republic of Korea. It's like it's just not, but it is in name. It's but yeah, no, you're right, Rachel. The consequentialist position there, that's quite a hefty one that has to be addressed.
Yeah,
and I think our common ground. So to put Rachel's point another way is that it's been known in political science for some time now that if you want to take a society out of poverty, the number one thing that we know works is to give women control over their birth cycles. So rather than being baby mills that are spitting out 7, 8, 9, 10 kids, if you give them access to quality information and education, you give them access to contraception, you give them control over their birth cycle, then suddenly they're only having 1 or 2 kids. They're able to invest in those children. It's less of an economic burden on society as a whole. You have kids that actually have parents that, women are able to wait until they have a stable family or a home life to provide for their kids. They have a stable income. The kids get better educations. They have fewer kids to compete for resources for. And as a result, society as a whole, like the levels of poverty rise. And yet you have people who, rather than just saying we oppose abortion, which I think the common ground of our discussion, like, I don't think any of the three of us are all for waiting until the 9th month and being like, all right, it's okay, right as this thing's about to come out, perform an abortion. And that's not legal in the US. It's not legal anywhere. The only times that ever happens is like this thing has died and we have to perform a surgery to get it out, or it is going to kill the mother and we have to do something to get it out.
Extreme circumstances called for extreme measures.
Yes. And so if instead what we see happening is, on that scale, we're all like, let's push it back to the earliest stage possible. Ideally, we're going to have easy access to birth control, and the woman never gets pregnant if she doesn't want to.
Yeah.
Now under, cases where that fails, it's like, okay, well, we should have like the morning after pill, or have like within the first 8 weeks, take a pill. Like those are the ideal solutions. So for those cases, it should be that birth control is super affordable and accessible everywhere and just like really easy to get a hold of. And, condoms should just be like everywhere. And,
just to contrast what you were saying about Mississippi earlier, if I can just like throw in a little bit about the UK in terms of birth control and stuff, but women can get the pill paid for by the NHS for free every month in the UK. Condoms are available to under 25s for free at most sexual health clinics, if not every sexual health clinic.
They're pretty cheap as well afterwards.
Yeah, they are. The morning after pill is free from most pharmacies. Otherwise, it's about £25. And if you're on a low income, you just if you have low income like I used to be, you can just fill in a form and you'll get all your prescriptions. If you need the morning after pill, you get that for free as well. It's amazing. Doctor's appointments free, so you don't have to worry. People talk about like long waiting times and stuff, but I've never waited more than like 15 minutes in my local health centre. You phone up an appointment, you get an appointment the same week, you go in, 15 minutes, you're done. Like, that's the difference between like Mississippi and here. Thankfully, I've never had to go through the whole abortion process, so I don't know what that's like. But I've had other like, I guess like gynecological issues, I guess you could say, and things like that. And it's just, it's so quick, it's so easy, it's free in the UK, and I've never felt pressured by anything in the UK. I've never felt like I wasn't in control of my body and my uterus, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And I think that's the way it should be for all women.
Yeah, well done, UK.
Yeah.
Well, and I'd be curious how much higher the percent, or how much earlier abortions happen in the UK, just because they're easy to access.
Like I said, 95% before 13 weeks.
Yeah, 95% before 13 weeks.
And the rest of them are usually like medical emergencies and stuff.
Yeah. Whereas in the US, it's like there are literally these misinformation centers called crisis pregnancy centers, or CPCs, in the US that will set up right next to abortion clinics. There are thousands of them, and they spread misinformation. They teach abstinence-only education, which doesn't work. They say that condoms, like in some cases, they'll say that condoms have a 20% failure rate, and they'll spread misinformation about contraceptives. And they'll try to talk you out of getting an abortion. They'll give
ridiculous.
They sometimes even will park outside of abortion clinics in comfortable, nice vans and be like, "Here, come on in. We'll take care of you." And like, they're not medically licensed. Mm-hmm. They don't provide accurate information, and sometimes they'll straight up lie to women and say, "Oh yeah, don't worry about getting your abortion right now. You can get it even, as late as the final trimester up in New York," which is a blatant lie. Like, it's completely patently false. And so there was one woman abortion doctor up in New York who was saying, like, a woman flew all the way up there and she only to find out that she'd been lied to, and she had to tell her that, "Oh, you have to become a mother because this person lied to you, and you could have gone in the first 8 weeks and gotten a frickin' pill."
Yeah.
And it's just disgusting.
This isn't just a minor thing to lie about either. This is something that's going to change your life for minimum the next 19 years. You got 9 months of pregnancy, which is traumatic and difficult on the body. You have the pregnancy, you have like giving birth itself, which again is traumatic on the body. And then you have 18 years of looking after someone emotionally and financially, and just
you give it up for adoption.
Yeah, which is also emotionally draining for a lot of people.
Also,
imagine
the poor kid. The poor kid.
Yeah.
Just
imagine the woman too, who is like, she's going through, she becomes pregnant. She could go in and just get a pill, but instead she's told, you have to carry it, or she's lied to and tricked into carrying it or something. So she's not ready. She's not financially able or capable of doing this or handling it emotionally, carrying it on her own. And yet she's basically manipulated into a situation where she gives birth to this kid. Even if she gives it up for adoption, she goes through 9 months of hormonal hell, of sickness, of vomiting, of feeling, like crap, developing a chemical and emotional attachment to this child, only to then turn around and be like, "I cannot afford to raise it. I feel like a shitty person. I cannot, I don't have the means to take care of this human. But now that I have this baby, like, I have to turn around and literally hand my baby to a stranger or to someone else to take care of it, to adopt it." And I just think that's extremely emotionally traumatizing. It's damaging to the woman, and it's horrific. It's barbaric. And for someone to say that they're pro-life and then to not think about the consequences, it just breaks my heart. And they're not pro-life.
I don't get why anyone would want to bring a life into the world not in the best possible conditions for it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you want to have kids and a baby, why, or you want other people to have kids and a baby, why not want those babies to have the best possible life, the most comfortable life? Why do you want an unwanted baby to be born into a world where it's not wanted and it's not going to be safe and happy and healthy?
Well, as an unwanted baby, the circumstances of my birth are rather sad, and that is that my mum trapped my dad by getting pregnant with me. I can tell you that there's massive consequences on that child. And if my mum had the reason, the rationality at the early stages to say, "Oh, well, I've made a mistake here and I'm being a complete arse. I should abort before there is any kind of pain reception, etc." She would have made the right choice. But once past that stage, and that's where the question has been throughout this whole conversation and throughout the conversation at large, that's where things change.
Yeah. I think though, like, it is important to note that, like, with people like yourself, great stuff can come out of, unwanted pregnancies. Like, it's not all doom and gloom. Kids aren't necessarily like, they're not going to be born and like thrown straight in a fire, but it is tough on them. And I just think we should encourage people to only have kids when it's the right time. I think that's the education we need.
Yeah, and if exactly, and if you have the facilities there for them to be educated and for them to make the wise choice before there is anything that is receiving pain or is human or wherever that line is, then we should be making whatever side we're on, we should be drawing all of our resources to make that possible. And I'm very proud of the UK for being what it is on this situation, but although I feel a part of glee where I can go, yes, we're doing well, I just feel dread and misery for the citizens of Mississippi. I just feel bad for the circumstances that plague your country, Thomas, because that is just abysmal.
The worst thing is, though, America isn't even the worst country.
No.
Think about all the other countries where abortion is just flat out illegal and it's impossible to get one. You have women literally mutilating themselves to try and get babies out of them that might have been put in there by rapists or paedophiles. Not even that. Someone makes a silly mistake and they're doomed for the next 19 years. Or they're told they're trash, that they kill themselves. It's horrific because they don't have those options.
Well, and coat hanger abortions and stuff that are extremely dangerous, and people, they die, they bleed to death. And sometimes some countries will even penalize the woman. So you're like, oh, well, I just, sliced up my insides and I'm, hemorrhaging to death. And yet, I can't go to a hospital or else they're going to put me in prison for murder because I tried to perform an at-home abortion. It's barbaric.
We need better sex education. We need better education on just kind of, basically around pregnancy, to be honest. And we need easier access for more people. And we need to take the stigma away as well. People can't be ashamed of wanting to take control of their bodies. Anyway, is there anything else you guys want to add or talk about in there? In here? Can't speak.
There's a lot of stuff, but we're already at an hour and 50 minutes.
Yeah.
Thomas, could you give me a quick answer to a quick question?
I can give you an answer. I can't promise the quick part.
We'll leave it with however succinct you can be. Where do you draw? Where do you draw the line?
To me, I feel like Roe v. Wade, got, as far as the time that they drew the line is good, just because it's like you don't start developing, a brain or the gray matter to process thought and to think and stuff until around the 6th month.
So it's about thinking mainly.
It's not until about 30 weeks that, under brain scans, you really start to detect the pattern signature of human, adult brains.
Okay.
And so for me, like pushing it back, not the 30th week, but they push it back earlier, for Roe v. Wade, I think that's a conservative point, but ideally, honestly, I would like to see most abortions much earlier. And I don't think that there's a woman on the face of the planet that thinks, oh, hey, wonderful, I'm pregnant. I could go and easily get, a quick pill fix, but I really want to wait this out and I want to see what it's like. And so I'm just going to carry this thing inside me and go through this hormonal hell for, weeks and weeks and months. And I'm going to, carry it until the, 6th month or the 5th month or something. And then I'm going to go in and have a much more complicated procedure. No, that just doesn't happen.
But there is women, plenty of them, which will be like, I can have this child, and they're confused and they're anxious and they're scared, and their partners are with them, and it turns out that 2 or 3 months in, the partner leaves, finds out that he was cheating on her granddad or her father dies, and the circumstances change, and then so does her prospects for being able to bring a child into the world. And so you're right, women don't run around, I wouldn't think, and there's no evidence for them running around going, let's get an abortion, yay. But there is, you got to have that room for those people.
And
right?
at that point, I would say, up until about 6 months. Past that, it's like, if it's the woman's health, if her life is at risk or something, and you have to, you perform an operation to save the woman, I think it should still be okay. And then beyond that, it's like, well, you've taken it this far, you're this far in, you have the baby, and if you want to give it up for adoption, you can.
Okay.
Just to play like devil's advocate slightly, we know that obviously like most women don't go into an abortion lightly. But let's say there is that small handful who basically use abortion as birth control and they don't think anything of it, and they're just like, oops, pregnant again, let me get an abortion. Do you think anything needs to be done about that? Or
I'm wondering where these women are, because in the US
Yeah.
it is not financially feasible. It's like $500 just to get a medical abortion, and it's like $40 for the generic morning after pill.
If it's
All
free, if it's free, just like it's free to get the after pill, I genuinely do believe there's going to be a lot of females that just don't think about it, and they just go, I'll do it next week, or I'll do it next week, and then it gets a bit late and they have to go through the procedure. I know women like that. And so does that mean that maybe you should say after a while you're going to start incurring a fine? I don't know. Or do you do nothing?
Start charging.
Maybe that is just the price of having that law, you know? So, like free speech. Free speech is wonderful, but the price is that you're going to have dickheads on the street yelling very nasty things.
Yeah.
Do you say there's a law? No, that's just necessarily the way it has to be. And I think that's probably the case for the circumstance you brought up, Rachel.
Yeah.
Honestly, even if women used abortion as a method of birth control, and they're getting it done in the first couple weeks, as opposed to just passing the cell, like I don't really see a strong ethical difference there.
I don't think ethical, but I do see resources, which is why I mentioned about money. It costs less on the economic system, on people.
Yeah, in which case, honestly, I don't see a problem with charging and having an economic incentive for the woman to take care of things ahead of time.
The problem is, like, one of the things you said earlier as an example, Steve, was like, imagine someone's financial situation changes like 2 months into pregnancy. Like, imagine they're made redundant, lose their job, they can't afford to have a baby.
Exactly.
How are they going to afford that surcharge if there's for an abortion, if there's that?
Yeah. No, I think
it's a lot cheap. It's a lot cheaper than having a baby, and
that's true. But is it still worth potentially going into debt to? Like,
well, then,
I
you
usually don't have just 500 quid spare cash around.
But
I
like
think
you
it should
said,
be
Rachel,
free,
where
period.
Rachel, you said if you went in, you have to pay unless you're economically, like if you can't afford it, you can fill out a form.
Oh, okay. Oh, it is a little tough in the UK though, because they tend to take your last year's earnings into account.
Okay.
Which is tough. So if you've just been made redundant, you might not qualify for it.
Oh, wow.
Then we're dealing with an issue of the UK's system of judging who can and can't afford it. Not so much. Seems like another issue.
Yeah, I think principally it should be free. It's like the UK is actually really quite good when it comes to health like this. If you get cancer, it's paid for. It's covered in your national insurance. It's covered in your tax. That your treatment is paid for. You're looked after. This isn't a practice that's taken, I understand, in the US, and that's quite scary.
What if I get cancer and come to the UK for treatment?
If you were part of the EU, probably. No, I'm kidding. But yeah.
Actually, how does it work in the UK for people who are living here? Because
I'm not entirely sure.
I'm friends with an American couple, and they say like one of the things they love about living in the UK is the NHS.
Well, they probably have to pay taxes if they have a work visa.
Yeah, I think if you pay UK taxes and you do a certain thing, then you probably can have
because they do both work over here.
I couldn't wait till I get cancer to then move to the UK.
No, you would have to know you had it and then go, I'm just going to move to the UK. And then after about half a year of only smoking marijuana, because apparently that's secure. It's not, people. Then you would go to the NHS and you'd go, I have a lump here. And they go, sir, that's a really big lump. You go, yeah, I know. It was almost like I knew that I had it a year ago in the USA. Get rid of it.
Well, David Avocado Wolf says that injecting yourself with your own urine is the best cancer cure. So just like pee in a little syringe and stick it in you.
You know,
because that sounds medically